I always think of the film Rocky, you know, the American movie made by Sylvester Stallone. Peter is to the story of Jesus like Rocky is to the people of Philadelphia. In a way, a kind of loser, somebody who is the last person you'd think of as a hero, and yet this guy emerges by the end of the story as somebody who represents what Christianity is all about.
In 1939, archaeologists excavating below the floor made an amazing discovery. They uncovered an underground street lined with magnificent first-century tombs. Hundreds of years before, Constantine packed them with soil to make a level foundation for his basilica. Then at one end, archaeologists uncovered a wall and a grave. It was directly beneath the altar and had all the hallmarks of the grave of Peter. Beside the grave, archaeologists found human bones, but they belonged to more than one individual. Then in 1956, a second investigation raised new hopes that this was Peter's grave after all.
A Roman epigraphist, a specialist in ancient inscriptions by the name of Margherita Guarducci, was brought in to try and decipher and analyze the graffiti that the Christian pilgrims had left on the buttressing wall built above Peter's grave. And as she began to analyze this graffiti, she noticed that there was a small niche called a localus, or a burial spot, that had been carved into this wall. And she asked the workmen of the Vatican what originally had sat in this particular localus, in this burial niche. The workmen at the time said, oh, that had been a set of bones that during the excavations had simply been cleared away and boxed along with all the other extra bones that had been discovered during the excavations, and it was sitting in a storeroom beneath the basilica.
An anthropological examination revealed that these bones were from the 1st century, and they came from a single individual. Traces of earth showed they'd been buried in the ground, not a tomb. These were the remains of a man in his 60s or his 70s. It was the right age for Peter. Then a further discovery left little doubt just whose bones these were.
These bones had been wrapped in a cloth made out of purple and gold and placed in this little niche, this little localus, which was lined with marble. So obviously it was a sign of great respect. And inside of this niche, above the bones, there was another set of Christian graffiti that had been written. 2 words in Greek, Petrus eni, Peter is within.
The Catholic Church returned the bones to their original resting place, beneath the altar at the heart of the Basilica in Rome. The evidence so far suggests that Peter was in Rome, but we don't know why he came here, or how he came to be named head of the Christian Church. To discover that, we have to find out more about Peter and the environment in which he lived. Peter was the fisherman that Jesus found in a poor community in Galilee. The traditional image of 1st century life here is humble fishermen living a hand-to-mouth existence in a rural backwater. But when archaeologists began to dig in Galilee, a very different picture of Peter and his community began to emerge.
Galilee was an active hub, trade center, commerce. Goods in large quantities were shipped and rapidly over well-made roads. Fleets of boats on the Sea of Galilee, which is also known as Kinneret Lake. So this was a world of commerce, a world of cities, as well as a world of agriculture and small towns and villages and hamlets.
So Galilee may not have been a rural backwater at all. In fact, many scholars believe it was much more than that.
They were not in a rustic environment and marginalized from the rest of the world, but in fact were part of a cosmopolitan that was very much part of the Roman Empire in the East. And Galilee and Judea to the south were regarded by the Romans as the cornerstone of the eastern part of their empire.
Galilee offers further clues about Peter's life. On the northern shores lie the ruins of a fishing village called Capernaum. In the center is a house, which for centuries has been a Christian place of worship. Historians are convinced that it was Peter's house.
Why would they venerate a particular house in Capernaum? The evidence would suggest that very early on they believed it was Peter's house, and eventually built a shrine, eventually built a church, and continued to build and expand on the site for centuries.
Peter's house tells us a huge amount about his economic status. The house consisted of a courtyard surrounded by rooms, the largest of which was 8 meters by 9 meters. This was a superior house, with a floor made of basalt stone. The Gospels say that Peter was married and had children. This house was large enough for a whole family.
This was a house that I would have to regard as middle class. It would accommodate an extended family. It was a prime piece of property in relationship to the Sea of Galilee. So I don't think Peter was a poor fisherman.
More information about Peter's economic status came to light in 1985, after a severe drought. As the sea level dropped, it revealed artifacts that had been hidden for thousands of years. Archaeologists digging at Ginosar, on Galilee's northwestern shore, found the remains of a 1st century boat, which had been preserved by silt and mud. The dimensions were similar to those given in the Bible for Peter's boat.
This boat would have required at least 12 people to handle it. So you couldn't be a poor fisherman from a single family and operate a fishing vessel like this. It strongly suggests that Peter was part of a fishing industry. And in fact, 2 of the disciples acquainted with Peter, that Jesus called the sons of Zebedee, it says in the Gospels that their father had hired servants who were working in the boat. And that is consistent with the boat that was uncovered 15 years ago.
So why would Peter, a successful businessman with a family, abandon his way of life to follow a young preacher named Jesus? The Romans had changed the economic infrastructure. They'd imposed heavy taxes on the Galileans and replaced bartering with a system of credit. Farmers and fishermen could borrow the money to buy seed and nets, but if the crops or the catch failed, the debt and the taxes had to be settled first. This would have been an important issue for Peter. As a businessman, he'd have had commitments to the people he employed, as well as a family to feed. So when Jesus delivered his revolutionary message, "Follow me," perhaps Peter saw in him a new way of life.
First of all, it was not a big movement. It started out very, very small. Jesus had an immediate circle of followers, namely the 12 disciples, all of whom were married. So you have 12, 24, plus the kids. So maybe you have an entourage, about 40 or 50 people meandering around, going around from place to place, and then attracting others. And probably it didn't grow too large.
Galilee was also a historical hotbed of political turmoil. There'd been uprisings against the Roman occupation in the past, which made the timing of Jesus' arrival just right. Some theologians, like John Drain, believe that Jesus was a rebel.
Jesus was a maverick, there's no doubt about that. Maybe to call him a hippie would be going too far, but clearly a person with lots of time on his hands, but a great vision. And the invitation seems to be to Peter, well, if this really grabs you, then how about hanging out with me? See what we can do about it, see what we can make of it, and we'll take it from there.
From the evidence so far, there appears to be nothing remarkable about Peter. The mystery is why such an ordinary man was chosen by Jesus to be his rock and become leader of the early church.
The first step is I want you to
Psychologists can
really
help
hold
people
the
identify
idea
their
of
own
belief.
personal strengths and weaknesses.
The reason I say that,
Candice Young has been counselling for the past 15 years.
you're going to go see.
One of her
that
skills is
proves
to
it.
assess leadership
Where there may be
ability.
one man that says that. You see what I think that Jesus, being who he is, could see not just the ego of Peter, his rashness, his emotionality. That's all ego stuff. But he was able to see the soul, or in psychology, what we call the self, the real person, the strength of character.
Jesus may well have had the gift to see into Peter's true self, but Peter's leadership qualities would still have had to be apparent to others, not least the disciples.
كان رائعا.
The first sign of his leadership potential is revealed in the Gospels in a famous episode when Jesus is said to have walked on water. Peter apparently tried to copy him. Although the Gospel writers may have written the story to show that Jesus had divine powers, the story also gives us an insight into Peter's character.
I think the walking on the water episode really gets Peter's personality. He's a person who's up for absolutely everything, which is probably why he said yes to Jesus in the first place, even though it probably was not a sensible thing to do.
Whether the story was a miracle or a metaphor, we cannot tell. But what the Gospel writers did do was single out Peter as the disciple who was enthusiastic enough to take a risk. Even though he failed, he was the only one who tried.
Peter's a very complex personality. Somebody who is impetuous, he's eager to please. He is the guy always raising his hand in class saying, I know the answer, and then the teacher says, no, you got it wrong again.
Peter's enthusiasm appears to be his only attribute, hardly the qualification for the leader of a brand new faith. When Jesus named him the rock on which he would build his church, it must have come as a surprise for the disciples. One interpretation is that Jesus meant it ironically.
Jesus sets him up and says, you're the kind of person I could build a church on, because he's not perfect and he's a bit wobbly. Jesus had a great sense of humor as well. So, as he says, makes all those kinds of statements, I imagine he's got a twinkle in his eye, which you don't get off pages of a book, of course. You just get the words, and he's saying, oh yeah, Peter, you're really a rock, you know? A really reliable guy. Yes, we all know that. Look at what he did, etc., etc. But actually, you're the kind of guy who I need to be part of this new way of being.
If Jesus was being ironic, perhaps he saw in Peter an ordinary man, outspoken yet passionate. Unreliable, perhaps, but worthy of respect. A man to look up to. Even so, we should expect to find some evidence in the Gospels that Peter was dependable and at the very least understood Jesus' message. However, in the Gospel of John, There is an incident in the Garden of Gethsemane at the time of Jesus' arrest, which shows that Peter didn't understand his message.
Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and there's Peter with a sword, and he lops off an ear of the servant of the high priest. You'd expect by this time he would understand that the man that he's following is a man of peace, and yet here is Peter with a Roman gladius. It's not just any old sword or a spear, but a Roman sword in the garden when Jesus is apprehended. So Peter got it wrong again.
Not only did Peter misunderstand Jesus' message, there was another essential quality that he appeared to be lacking: loyalty. Before he was arrested, Jesus had predicted that Peter would disown him 3 times before the cock crowed. After Jesus was taken away to be tried, Peter followed him to the house of the high priest Caiaphas. As he waited in the courtyard, he was asked 3 times by servants if he knew Jesus. 3 times he denied him.
Peter saw Jesus do amazing things, which only confirmed his faith. But in the end, he was afraid, as most people are. He was conservative. He was afraid he might lose what he had. He might lose his life. And so when things took a turn for the worse, Jesus is arrested. That wasn't part of the plan as far as Peter was concerned. Peter thought, it's all over. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe in believing in Jesus, he had placed his faith in the wrong person.
Peter doesn't appear to be leadership material. We might well have reached a dead end in our investigation if it weren't for one more source. The New Testament represents only a small proportion of the writings about Jesus. There were many other texts written by Christians which were omitted from the New Testament because they were considered unsuitable or too controversial by the Church. These are the apocryphal texts.
The word apocrypha means hidden away. By coming up with a group of early Christian writings that became the New Testament, they were trying to make a determination of which works were the most central for determining questions of doctrine.
Dozens of these invaluable texts were discovered in Egypt in 1945, in the desert area of Nag Hammadi. Some cast a different light on Peter's character, and one, called the Sophia, or Wisdom of Jesus, gives a completely different account of the role of women, like Mary Magdalene.
In the Sophia of Jesus Christ, for example, this text talks not just about 12 male disciples, but it talks about 7 women and 12 male disciples. And all of them are given the command to go out and preach the gospel. And Mary Magdalene is very prominent among these.
If Mary Magdalene was also a candidate for leadership, that could have fostered rivalry between her and Peter. A rivalry which could be highly damaging to the movement. There's even evidence to show that Peter let his pride and personal feelings influence his behavior. Hardly the behavior of a leader.
Mary's leadership role doesn't go uncontested, as we might well imagine. She is accused of making things up. She is accused of doing this for her own sake. But Peter comes in with, are we supposed to believe that Jesus preferred her to us? He'd said to her, we know that the Savior loved you more than other women, but now it's become apparent that the Savior loved her more than them. And that's precisely the rub.
The evidence from these apocryphal Gospels makes Peter look more like a source of dissent than a great leader. After Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples were left in a state of total despair. Instead of being the rock and a source of inspiration, Peter returned home to Galilee.
I think from an emotional point of view, he's absolutely crushed. And he's essentially gone back to his old job. He's become a fisherman again. I mean, Jesus is dead. It's over. The hopes are crushed.
Leaderless, the Jesus movement began to fall apart. But then, on the shores of Galilee, something happened. According to the Gospels, Jesus appeared. Whether or not it was a vision, it spurred Peter on to take up his role again.
I think psychologically it's sound to say that shame also fueled his transformation after the resurrection. Because when we feel shame, we feel a need to make some repair on that. So that would kind of fuel that action to really do good as a leader of the church, to kind of make it up for betraying him.
His mission apparently clear to him, Peter took up the role of leader of the Jesus movement. With new confidence, he led the disciples into the streets and preached openly. The Bible says Peter discovered that he, like Jesus, had the power to heal. As word spread, people brought the sick and the wounded to lie in his shadow.
Within the Acts of the Apostles, we also have Peter heal people with his shadow or with a handkerchief. So this tradition of miracle working is something that was very much accepted, especially for the generation of the apostles, all through Christian literature. That was one of the ways the message spread.
Peter was a changed man, but he had a long way to go before he could prove he was capable of fulfilling the role that Jesus had assigned him. And his continued authority wasn't guaranteed. There were other figures contending for the leadership. The path ahead was fraught with difficulties. Paul, a radical newcomer to the movement, was a zealous and passionate convert. He wanted Christianity to spread beyond Israel to the whole of the Mediterranean. Paul wanted to preach to non-Jews, Gentiles. Then there was James, the brother of Jesus, who wanted only Jews in the movement. According to Paul's letters, Peter was the man in the middle, sharing the missionary work with both James and Paul. But the underlying message in the letters is clear. The actual leader of the early church was not Peter, as tradition supposes, but James.
What's so interesting is Paul complains that Peter had acted properly toward Gentile Christians, but when men from James came, Peter felt intimidated and began to be aloof from the Gentile Christians. That tells me that James exercised the authority and Peter deferred to it.
The split between James and Paul presented Peter with a unique opportunity. The conflict could easily have destroyed the early church. Instead of taking sides, Peter journeyed throughout the Mediterranean, preaching to Gentiles and Jews alike. It was a crucial decision. The more he traveled, the more his authority in the Christian communities grew. But the real test of Peter's leadership was to come in Rome, capital of the empire.
As the saying from antiquity goes, all roads lead to Rome. That's true. Another way of saying it, though, is all roads come out of Rome. And that was done deliberately. The Roman legions could march on those roads and get to any part of the empire quickly. Well, if the Christian gospel took root in Rome and became strong, and there were many Jewish people and many synagogues in Rome, this could then become a power base, a platform for the early church to launch out from and spread throughout the Roman Empire. So it makes good sense to see Peter, Paul, and others desiring to go to Rome and establish the church there.
The apocryphal texts say that Peter took his family to Rome with him, a sign that he intended to stay there for good.
That's corroborated by 1 Corinthians in chapter 9, where Paul mentions that Peter takes his wife around with him. In fact, Paul says, it's me and Barnabas alone that are really the exception to the rule. It's like all the apostles take their wives with them in the ministry.
There's even evidence in the catacombs that Peter's family were with him in Rome. One of the frescoes at Santa Domitilla shows the figure of a martyr, Petronella, who some believe was Peter's daughter.
We have here a picture of the deceased, a lady called Veneranda, and next to her we have St. Petronella, often associated in legend with the daughter of Peter, from whom we have certain records from the 2nd century. And what is happening in the fresco is that Petronella is actually leading Veneranda into paradise. Interestingly, the fresco is also illustrated with a satchel of scrolls of the law. Now this perhaps suggests the traditional linking of Petronella with St. Peter, because many of the frescoes of Peter and Paul show the same theme of the scrolls of the law.
To establish himself as leader of Rome's Christian community, Peter had to have credibility. If the people believed he could cure the sick, that would make his job easier.
Claims to have a connection to divinity had to be backed up because such claims were so numerous. You had to deliver the goods, you had to do the deeds in addition to preaching the message.
But Peter's bid to establish a Christian church in Rome was challenged by a magician who, through mass hypnosis or sleight of hand, persuaded the crowds that he too had supernatural powers.
In the interim, a figure known from other sources named Simon Magus arrives in Rome. And Simon Magus makes some astounding claims, but he's very convincing. He claims to be a divinity himself, and he proves his claim by flying through midair, unassisted. This turns many of the new Christians away from the faith, and they start to follow Simon instead, because they're completely convinced by his demonstration of divine power. It's this situation to which Peter is called.
Simon Magus is the arch enemy of Peter. It's kind of like the Joker to Batman. And Simon Magus kind of steps into the void and becomes the new leader. And other than just a small handful of faithful Christians, the whole church goes over to Simon Magus.
The apocryphal Acts of Peter say that after a series of confrontations, Peter and Simon Magus end up in a duel. The Acts describe the final scene where Simon Magus tricks the crowd into believing he is levitating above the Roman skyline. Peter has to stop him.
Peter sees that Simon is actually being held aloft by demons, And so Peter's response to this is to make a prayer against the demons in the name of Jesus Christ. The demons become afraid. They drop Simon Magus. He falls on the ground and breaks his leg in 4 pieces. And then he goes off to get medical attention, and the doctor botches the job and he dies. And that's how Peter disposes of Simon Magus.
It's impossible, 2,000 years later, to determine exactly what the duel entailed. But we do know from other first-century sources, like the writings of Eusebius and Irenaeus, that Simon Magus really did exist. As for the magic, this was very much a part of the fabric of first-century belief and practice.
Well, Jesus is presented as doing things like this too. Jesus walks on the waters, it seems kind of levitation. Jesus exorcises spirits. Jesus raises people from the dead. Jesus cures cripples and paralytics and so on. These are all part of magic in those days. So, I mean, I don't accept that the Jesus character did these things. But clearly Simon Magus was pretending to do things like that. That's why he's called the magician.
There is no independent confirmation of Peter's victory over Simon Magus, but there are signs he is likely to have been victorious. We know from another second-century historian, Tertullian, that Peter began to baptize his converts in the Tiber River, in the heart of Rome.
When Tertullian is describing the practice of baptism, he says that normally it is conducted in living water, that is in flowing water. As he says, John baptized in the Jordan and Peter baptized in the Tiber. So clearly, as far as Tertullian is concerned, and I think it's historically true, Peter was remembered for having baptized in the Tiber River.
But success came at a price. Peter's teachings challenged Roman morality. The more pagans he converted to Christianity, the more he jeopardized his chances of staying alive. Peter's doctrines of strict Jewish practice,
And that's what gets Peter into trouble.
not surprisingly, Peter upset 2 Roman senators. They had him incarcerated in the Tullian prison on the Mamertine Hill, along with his old friend Paul. But according to tradition, faith had a hand in their release.
When Paul and Peter were locked up together, they managed to convert 2 of their guards and a number of others, whom they baptized in the prison using water from a fountain which, so the tradition says, had miraculously appeared in its floor. Now, whether that tradition is historically accurate or not is one question, but clearly it does fit very nicely into what I take to be historically correct, and that is that when Peter was in Rome, he baptized converts.
Peter may have been released by his converted guards, but even though he was free again, his troubles were far from over.
Peter and Paul picked a bad time to be in Rome in the 60s. This is when Nero, the last of the Julian Caesars, was in his worst time of insanity. And he was fearing conspiracies against his life. He was absolutely crazy. And he used Christians as scapegoats, especially when rumors were floating about that he was the cause of the fire that burned down 1/2 of the city of Rome. So he blamed the Christians.
Nero began an unprecedented and horrific campaign of persecution. The The Acts of Peter tell of his terrible dilemma. He could stay in the city with his fellow Christians and die, or leave to fight another day. A situation not unlike the one he faced on the night of Jesus' arrest in the high priest's courtyard. Now, with those instincts for self-preservation surfacing again, Peter made a tactical decision to leave the city. Perhaps he reasoned that he would be of more use to the church alive than dead.
These are the ancient flagstones of the Via Appia. About 4 miles down here, we get to the gates of Rome. If you wanted to get out of Rome in a hurry, this was a good road to take. Peter donned a disguise and then walked along this road to make his escape from the city. And as he was walking along this road, somewhere around this spot, the tradition says that he met the Lord coming from this direction into Rome. And when he came to Jesus, he said, "Where are you going, Lord?" And Jesus said to him, "I'm going into Rome to be crucified again." So Peter turned around, made his way back into the city through the gates and going back in to face his awful death.
No one can tell whether it was the vision of Jesus or guilt that changed Peter's mind, but all the apocryphal sources agree that Peter turned back. This decision to return to Rome is perhaps one of the clearest signs yet that Peter had become a leader who could inspire others through his actions.